True. Let's go to Karma Green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirates' lines, we break the bondage tight. Kamji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Chimpy drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the Kamji verse.
Today we're going to talk about how the recent study on the Nurat Old Kingdom mummy, as well as Salem et al.'s analysis of ancient green Saharans, proves that ancient Kemet specifically, and then the Natufians and ancient North Africa more generally, were black. So these studies, again, provide compelling evidence that ancient Kemet and the entirety of North Africa were inhabited by black people. These populations were primarily dark-skinned, but exhibited the full spectrum of phenotypic diversity encompassed within what Cheikh Anta Diop called black, and we could call this Ethiopian blackness. This same diversity persists among indigenous African populations today. In the study by Salem et al., although the authors claimed to demonstrate that the Sahara acted as sort of a genetic barrier separating infra-Saharan Africans from super-Saharan Africans in the north, their own data suggests the opposite. The study's core methodological flaw lies in its misuse of F4 statistics, a tool designed to measure genetic drift between populations. Salem et al. Configured their function as F4 chimpanzee, Zladikun, African, Takukori, combining a broad African category with a specific ancient Saharan group, Takukori, on the same side of the semicolon. This configuration obscures whether Takukori shares closer ties with African lineages or with early Eurasians, represented by Zladikun. A more appropriate setup would reorient the function as F4 chimpanzee, Takukori, African, Zladikun, placing Takukori as the test population. This would allow a direct comparison of its allele sharing with Africans versus early Eurasians. A negative z-score would indicate that Takukori is closer to Zladikun, while a positive score would suggest a closer relationship to Africans. Such a configuration would clarify genetic affinities and avoid conflating populations with different levels of genetic drift. Additionally, the study's reliance on ghost populations, such as the poorly defined ancestral North African group, further complicates their conclusions. Ancient North Africans lack a clear genetic distinction from so-called sub-Saharan or infra-Saharan Africans, and they become a statistical mirage, inflating the perceived uniqueness of North African ancestry while masking evidence of sustained interaction between the Sahara and infra-Saharan African populations. According to the conventional Africanist model, most West and Central Africans were present in North Africa during the Holocene. Takukori would have been present with, the ancestors of most modern West and Central Africans. According to this model, they would be the descendants of Saharan herders who are derived from the Iranian or Ibero-Mauritian culture, right? Who migrated south, during the terminal Pleistocene. And then, 11,000 years ago to about 5,000 years ago, they existed within the ancient Sahara, exemplified by the Kithian and the Tenarian culture, right? So this would be where the ancestors of most of these, modern West and Central African populations existed, within Takukori. And when we correct the F4 statistics and we analyze, the genetic history of the African continent, we can see that there's clearly a relationship between these ancestral North African populations and modern Black Africa. So the Nurat study by Morez et al. Revealed that the Old Kingdom mummy's ancestry, according to the study, was approximately 80% related to the Middle Neolithic Moroccans from Skirat Ruwazi or SKH site, and then 20% related to Neolithic Mesopotamian populations, particularly in the Levant, right? Now, according to Samoas et al., the ancestry of this Middle Neolithic cemetery at Skirat Ruazi can be modeled as a two-way admixture that's about 76.4% Levant Neolithic, right? Or Natufian related, and then 23.6%, local Northwest Africans, represented by Tafarat or the so-called Ibero-Mauritians or Iranians. Again, according to their analysis, even if you look at their admixture plot, that Levant Neolithic is derived from the Natufian population, right? So that Levantine ancestry that they're referring to, both in the Merezetal study as well as this Samoa's study, is Natufian. So essentially what they're arguing is that they're trying to separate the population of ancient Kemet, in the Old Kingdom mummy, by closely associating it with Natufians. And they're using these different names, Levantine, Mesopotamian. They're trying to confuse you with these chronological timelines. But the essential argument that they're making, especially by showing Middle Neolithic affinity, according to the analysis of this population, is that this group is derived from the Natufians. This presents a paradox for the authors, as these findings actually reinforce the Ethiopian migration model that's long been proposed by African-centered scholars, from the emanation of Homo sapiens sapiens, onto the planet from an African center, to the associations between classical and contemporary Africa, as we can observe by many of these ancient remains. According to Brace et al., the Natufians are craniofacially most similar to so-called Niger-Congo populations, including Nigerians, Senegalese, Burkinabes, Cameroonians, and the so-called Bantu populations of Central and Southern Africa, these Chiaga populations. These are dark-skinned peoples whose paternal ancestry can be traced to ancient North Africa, right? Speaking of the Natufians. They were dark-skinned people like the Nurat Old Kingdom mummy literally was dark to black-skinned, according to the Merezetal study, dark to black skin with dolichocephaly, or long skulls, and tropical body proportions. The only people who exhibit these traits are modern black African populations. So again, going through all of their, mislabeling or using terms to confuse, when you look at the Natufians craniofacially, right, they are linked to so-called Niger-Congo populations. So according to Lazaridis et al., genetically, the Natufians are believed to descend from ancient North Africans, or the so-called Ibero-Mauritian Iranian culture of ancient North Africa, precisely where the ancestors of most West and Central Africans were in the terminal Pleistocene, if we accept the conventional Africanist model that posits them descending from Saharan herders, right? Now, Musa Lam, has sparked an intriguing, refinement of this, general Africanist perspective by definitively showing the relationship between the Sahara as a grandparent, the Happy River Valley Basin or dynastic Africa as the parent, and then modern West and Central Africa as the children. But again, if we accept this model, that West and Central Africans directly descend from Saharan herders, their ancestors in the terminal Pleistocene would have been exactly where the ancestors of the Natufians were, according to this study by Lazaridis. The Natufians themselves can be sequenced as approximately about a third Mbuti related, and the Mbuti people in Central Africa, linguistically aligned with the Nilo-Saharan or Niger-Congo groups using Greenbergian configuration, and then Paleo-African or Niger-Egyptian using the Obangian framework. So that's about a third of the Natufian ancestry, according to Lazaridis. 2/3 of it are Euro-African related, Euro-African being the ancient Africans who left the African continent and migrated to Europe while maintaining, the majority of their traits, their African traits. And this is very, very controversial, and it gets back into the African-centered argument, or the so-called Afrocentric argument, or Afrocentrism if we're to use the conservative castigation. Because when we're analyzing these genetic histories, we examine the degree of Neanderthal introgression. And when we look at some of the ancient Europeans, they show African variants in their genes. Africans not only have dark skin, but can have blue eyes as well under certain, genetic diversity that's seen on the African continent. Many African populations are lactose milk intolerant and some are not. Modern studies of some ancient European DNA remains show them similar to Africans, with the dark-skinned, blue-eyed combination of some contemporary Africans and lactose intolerant. So when we look at the ancient Labrana Mesolithic European, we see that this remain had African variants of skin pigmentation and the lactose intolerance of many African populations, right? The biggest surprise was to discover that this individual, this Labrana European, possessed African versions in the genes that determine the light pigmentation of current Europeans, which indicates that he had dark skin, Leluza Fox said. But the latest findings show that Labrana, one, still had dark skin and had been around the European continent for 40,000 years, meaning fair skin probably evolved millennia later. And these are scientists on the ancient Mesolithic European Labrana man, right? So this is clear that many of these ancient Europeans, such as the Villabruna hunter-gatherers, used in this study, had African variants of skin pigmentation, right? They are more closely related to these African populations. This is very, very clear. Extremely, extremely clear. So again, when we're looking at the Natufians, about 1/3 of their ancestry could be Mbuti related, and about 2/3 of their ancestry could be related to these ancient North Africans, these ancestral North Africans, who left the African continent but maintained their African traits. And this speaks again to the craniofacial, association between the Natufians and the so-called Niger-Congo populations. So when you would be reconstructing the remains of these ancient Natufians, you would be using these modern infra-Saharan African populations to do the reconstruction. When we look at it phylogenetically, the Natufians carry the African EM123 lineage that is a descendant of the EZ830 observed within Nurau, right? This is a Northeast African clade that is found today across Central and Southern Africa. It's descended in EM293 that confirms many of the so-called Bantu or the Chiaga narratives that speak to a relationship between the Kinyarwanda civilization, the Zulu civilization, the Shona, the Lozi civilization, the many Ngala civilizations of Central Africa, Congo civilizations, to classical Africa, to ancient Kemet, describing the sojourn of their ancestors down the different tributaries of the Happy River Basin, into the Zambezi, into the Congo River Valley, into the Orange River in Southern Africa, and many other river and lacustrine systems. So when we look at it phylogenetically, we can see that the Natufians had a lineage associated with ancient North Africans. They can be seen as ancestral North African and Mbuti related, right? And when you look at these studies in context and you really get down to the nitty gritty, right? Not only is Nurat, that old kingdom mummy, a black-skinned individual with a long skull and tropical body proportions, but when you look at the genetics and the so-called Levantine-related ancestry that is actually Natufian, this is a deep ancestral North African ancestry. This is a deep African ancestry. And many of these genetics, they play, racist games and they try to confound, genetic drift with gene flow, right? So a lot of the similarities that you may see between these ancient, out of Africa populations and modern, Levantine populations is due to genetic drift. It's due to the commonality, deep commonality within, the out of Africa ancient population, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that there was a recent migration from the Levant. This speaks to the heterogeneity and the diversity of the African continent, in that within classical Africa, many of our African populations still, retained signatures associated with the ancient ancestral North Africans, right? But if we look at, Boubacar Sow's research and dealing with the peopling of the Green Sahara during the Holocene, many of the different groups, from the hunter-gatherers to the aquatic fisher populations, that would be linked to the Consiore, culture complex, that would be the pre-dialectical ancestor of the Pharaonic civilization in most contemporary West and Central Southern African populations, as is validated by both genetics, archaeology, and historical linguistics, to the so-called pastoral populations. All of these are rooted in the Happy River Basin. And even when we look at the pastoral domesticates across the African continent, from cows to goats to chickens to dogs, we can see a starting point within, Northeast Africa during the late Holocene, and then a migration into infra-Saharan West and Central Africa. So it's clear, from these studies, these scholars try to play games. They try to play games with Basal Eurasian. They try to play games with Levantine, but in reality, these are ancestral North African populations, right? These are dark-skinned populations that preceded the AT, 111 gene, for light skin that evolved around 10,000 years ago, right? Populations that preceded this, they're clearly, African populations related to modern infra-Saharan people today, from the craniofacial, aspects of it, to the genetics, even to the culture. So it is very, very clear that we should not be falling for any of the propaganda, present, within these different spaces, because it's just foolish to suggest that something like the A111T gene, associated with light-skinned population being 10,000 years old would be, proliferated across the North African region, as many of these propagandists are trying to suggest. So if we stay strong and close to our methodology, we'll never let this false racist propaganda defeat us. And that's all I got for this one. Stay strong, stay dominant, let that black truth spread. And I hope to catch you on the next one. Peace.
Let's go to Karma Green, we steady on the rise. Digging truth from ancient scenes, we open blinded eyes. Rhyme sharp like pirates' lines, we break the bondage tight. Kamji speaking revolution, keep the fire burning. Shimpy drums guide our stride, we march with purpose proud. No more silence, we collide, our voices thunder loud. Politics and history, we stitch them in every verse. From Pharaoh's throne to Yaoundé streets, we claim the Kamji verse.